a dead mouse, dropped from a helicopter, packed with a pain reliever you probably have in your bathroom cabinet right now. That is a strange new weapon Florida is testing against one of the most destructive invasive predators on the planet, and the story behind it is stranger than fiction. Stick around, because by the end of this video you will understand why scientists believe the humble Tylenol tablet might succeed where 20 years of hunters, traps, and cash bounties have failed. For 2 decades, Florida has thrown almost everything it could think of at the Burmese python problem. The state paid professional trackers to go out and remove snakes. It ran public hunting competitions with prize money attached. It even trained ordinary citizens to identify and report sightings. And still, the population kept growing. Part of the reason is simple biology. A single female Burmese python can lay several dozen eggs in one season, and some clutches have been reported as high as 3 dozen. You cannot outhunt an animal that reproduces that fast and hides that well. Eventually, researchers stopped asking how to find more snakes and started asking a very different question. If hunting isn't working, could the snake's own appetite be turned into the trap? That idea did not originate in the Everglades. It was born nearly 8,000 miles away, on the tiny Pacific island of Guam. Shortly after the Second World War, a brown tree snake hitched a ride into Guam hidden inside military cargo. The island's native birds had never lived alongside a climbing snake predator before, so they nested low in the open with no instinct to protect their eggs. To the newly arrived snake, the island wasn't just habitat. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet with no natural competition. In the early 1980s, a graduate student named Julie Savage traveled to Guam to figure out why the forest bird populations were vanishing. She expected a jungle full of birdsong. Instead, she found near total silence, and eventually spotted the culprit lying at her feet. When her research was published in 1987, it confirmed something many scientists found hard to believe. A single invasive species had wiped out most of an island's native birds. By then, the damage was done. 10 of Guam's 12 native forest bird species were gone, and the snakes had multiplied to the point where they were regularly climbing power lines and causing hundreds of blackouts a year. While hunting for any tool that could slow the invasion, researchers with the United States Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services made a discovery nobody expected. One of the most common over-the-counter pain relievers in the world turned out to be highly toxic to these snakes. That medicine is acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol. The reason it works comes down to snake biology. Mammals like humans have liver enzymes that break acetaminophen down safely. Snakes largely lack that enzyme pathway. Instead of processing the drug, their blood loses its ability to carry oxygen efficiently, and the animal gradually weakens until it stops breathing. Published toxicology studies found an 80-milligram dose, roughly the amount in a couple of children's fever tablets, was reliably lethal to brown tree snakes within about a day. For an animal that size, that is an extraordinarily small dose. USDA scientists spent years turning that biological quirk into something operational. They developed a system that pairs dead neonatal mice, each holding a tablet of concentrated acetaminophen, with a small flotation device designed to catch in tree branches rather than fall to the forest floor, keeping the bait away from ground-dwelling animals. Eventually, they scaled this up to aerial delivery, with helicopters dropping treated mice across the forest canopy in carefully planned patterns. Field trials on Guam showed measurable drops in snake activity in treated zones, which is exactly what prompted researchers to ask whether the same basic idea could work against Florida's Burmese pythons. In 2010, USDA researchers Richard Malden and Peter Savory set out to test that question directly. Working at the National Wildlife Research Center in Fort Collins, Colorado, they ran controlled laboratory trials, dosing juvenile Burmese pythons and Nile monitor lizards, another large invasive reptile established in South Florida, with measured amounts of acetaminophen delivered inside dead mice. Their results, later published in the journal Wildlife Research, showed a clear dose-response pattern. A 20-milligram dose killed a modest share of the young pythons. At 40 milligrams, the death rate jumped sharply. At 80 milligrams, every python in the trial died. The Nile monitors turned out to be even more sensitive, with a 40-milligram dose proving fully lethal. On paper, this looked like exactly the tool Florida needed. There's an important catch, though, and it has to do with how Burmese pythons actually grow up. A newly hatched python is roughly the size of an adult brown tree snake, and at that stage of life it behaves completely differently from the giant, water-loving adults most people picture. Young pythons hunt mice, birds, frogs, and other small prey, and unlike the massive adults that spend much of their time submerged and hidden, juveniles are active, curious climbers that move constantly through bushes, shrubs, and low branches. Researcher Kristen Hart, who has tracked young pythons using radio telemetry, has documented exactly this kind of restless, exploratory movement. That behavior matters enormously for a bait strategy, because it means young pythons are far more likely to encounter and investigate bait placed in the vegetation than the massive, wary adults that hunters already struggle to find. And this is where the long-term math becomes interesting. Scientists don't necessarily need to kill every adult python already established in the wild. If enough juveniles fail to survive the breeding age year after year across a wide enough area, fewer snakes replace the older ones that die naturally, and over roughly a decade the population could begin a slow decline on its own. The scale of the challenge, however, is enormous. Treating the Everglades properly would mean distributing bait far beyond a few thousand units. Researchers have discussed the need for repeated, large-scale distribution across one of the largest wetland systems in the country, and unlike the relatively simpler forest ecosystem on Guam, the Everglades supports roughly 350 bird species, dozens of reptile species, dozens of mammal species, and dozens of fish species. Introducing a toxicant into a system that complex is less like removing a single pest and more like performing surgery on a patient who is still very much alive, where a single miscalculation can ripple outward in unpredictable ways. History offers a useful, if uncomfortable, comparison here. In Australia, wildlife managers spent decades using a different toxicant, Compound 1080, to control invasive foxes and feral cats. Because many native Australian plants naturally produce a related compound, native wildlife had evolved a degree of tolerance that introduced predators lacked, which made the poison genuinely effective against foxes and cats while sparing much of the native fauna. Conservation programs using this approach help native species, like quolls, recover in some regions, and on Kangaroo Island the technique was credited with helping protect koalas from introduced predators. But the story wasn't uniformly clean. Poison carcasses were sometimes scavenged by native predators and birds of prey that were never the intended target, showing how difficult it can be to keep a toxin confined to the species it was designed for, even with careful planning. That risk of unintended casualties is exactly what concerns scientists about scaling acetaminophen bait across the Everglades. Not every treated mouse will be found by a python. Some will fall into water, where they could be eaten by fish, native water snakes, or other aquatic animals whose sensitivity to acetaminophen is not well understood. On land, a raccoon could scavenge a treated carcass, and if a bird of prey later fed that raccoon to its chicks, the effect could move up the food chain in ways that are almost impossible to observe directly. Perhaps the species conservationists worry about most is the Florida panther. Current estimates put the total adult population at somewhere between roughly 120 and 230 animals, confined to a shrinking range in southwest Florida that overlaps heavily with python territory. A panther's liver has the same limited capacity to process acetaminophen that a snake's does, and panthers are naturally curious, opportunistic hunters that will readily investigate an unusual carcass. Because the ranges of panthers and pythons overlap so closely, there's essentially no way to deploy bait across the region without some level of risk to this critically small population, which is why any full-scale rollout would require extremely careful placement, monitoring, and further non-target testing before it could move beyond controlled trials. It's worth noting that acetaminophen bait would not replace the removal methods Florida already relies on, but rather supplement them. The state runs an annual public hunting event each August, where registered participants compete for cash prizes based on the number and length of pythons they remove, and it also pays a rotating team of contracted hunters to patrol python habitat year-round. One of the more effective techniques to come out of that program involves so-called scout snakes, male pythons fitted with radio transmitters and released back into the wild during breeding season. Because male pythons instinctively track down females by scent, researchers can follow a tagged male straight to a breeding female, often finding and removing several additional snakes clustered around her at once. These methods have removed thousands of pythons from South Florida over the years. Yet officials openly acknowledge that no combination of hunting, trapping, and tracking has come close to eliminating the population, let alone slowing its geographic spread. That persistent gap between effort and results is precisely why a passive, self-deploying tool like toxic bait remains so appealing to researchers, even with all the ecological caution it demands. Now that you understand the strategy and the stakes, it's worth stepping back to look at the animal itself, because the Burmese python is a genuinely remarkable predator, invasive status aside. It is one of the largest snake species on Earth, non-venomous, with a dark, patterned body covered in brown blotches outlined in black. In the wild, adults commonly reach around 16 feet, and while unverified reports of much larger individuals circulate online, scientifically confirmed measurements top out lower than the legend suggests. The longest python officially documented in Florida measured just over 19 feet and was captured in the Big Cypress National Preserve in 2023. Female pythons tend to be noticeably heavier and more muscular than males, a trait known as sexual dimorphism, even though the difference in length between the sexes is comparatively small. In their native range, Burmese pythons are found across a huge swath of South and Southeast Asia, from eastern India and Nepal through Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and into parts of southern China and Indonesia. They are highly adaptable, at home in grasslands, marshes, swamps, forests, and river valleys, and they need reliable access to water. They are excellent swimmers, capable of staying submerged for around 30 minutes, and surprisingly strong climbers as juveniles, though adults spend most of their time on the ground because of their sheer size and weight. They are primarily nocturnal, relying on dense vegetation to stay concealed while they wait to ambush prey. In colder parts of their range, and even in Florida during winter, they enter a period of reduced activity called brumation, which also helps prepare their reproductive systems for the breeding season each spring. Females lay their eggs, usually in March or April, and unlike many reptiles, they stay with the clutch to guard and warm the eggs during incubation, an unusually attentive form of parental care for a snake. So, how did an animal native to Asian jungles end up establishing a permanent breeding population in South Florida? The exotic pet trade is the primary answer. Government estimates suggest that around 180,000 Burmese pythons were legally imported into the United States between 1975 and 2018. Many of those snakes eventually ended up outside captivity, whether through accidental escapes or deliberate release by owners who underestimated how large and demanding these animals would become. By the year 2000, escaped and released pythons had already established a self-sustaining breeding population in the South Florida ecosystem, and the species has proven extraordinarily difficult to remove ever since. Surveys estimate that trained search teams have only about a 1 to 3% chance of locating an individual python in a given area during any single search, and government researchers report that even in well-established habitat like Everglades National Park, it can take around 8 hours of dedicated searching to find just one snake. The python's range has continued to expand well beyond its original stronghold. Wildlife officials say the species is now established from the area around Lake Okeechobee south to Key Largo, and from western Broward County west into Collier County. More recently, biologists confirmed a separate satellite population in western Charlotte County, on Florida's Gulf Coast north of Naples and Fort Myers, a location well outside the historical range. Researchers who study the pattern say this new colony doesn't look like a gradual natural spread from the Everglades population. Instead, the evidence points toward escaped or intentionally released captive snakes establishing an entirely new breeding group on their own, echoing exactly how the original invasion began decades earlier. As one wildlife biologist involved in the research has put it, Burmese pythons are generalist apex predators with almost no natural checks in Florida, which is precisely why removing them from ecosystems they invade has become such a priority for conservation officials. That same combination of traits, adaptability, calm temperament as juveniles, and impressive size, is also what has long made Burmese pythons popular in the exotic pet trade, and it is worth understanding why that popularity became part of the problem. Young pythons often appear easy to handle, but they grow extremely fast, with some individuals capable of adding several feet of length within their first year alone if kept well fed. By around 4 years old, most reach adult size, though they continue growing slowly for their entire lives, which can span 2 decades or more in captivity with proper care. That means owning one is a genuine long-term commitment, not a casual purchase. Despite their generally calm reputation, adult pythons are powerful constrictors capable of delivering serious bites and requiring large, secure, and expensive enclosures as they mature, which is exactly the combination of factors that has led some owners, over the years, to release animals they were no longer prepared to keep. So, where does that leave Florida's acetaminophen strategy? The science behind it is real, peer-reviewed, and already operational on Guam, where it has measurably reduced brown tree snake activity in treated areas. Extending it to the Everglades is a far more delicate undertaking, given the sheer size of the ecosystem, the number of species that call a home, and the presence of critically endangered animals like the Florida panther within the same territory. Whether this approach becomes a genuine turning point in the fight against one of the country's most damaging invasive species, or simply one more tool with limited and carefully restricted use, will likely depend on years of additional field testing before any large-scale rollout is even considered. What do you think? Could a strategy this unconventional actually work at the scale the Everglades demands, or does the risk to native wildlife outweigh the potential benefit? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this one, subscribe and check out the next video on your screen.